And Nash, can you confirm that we are indeed streaming?
Frank should be able to make the confirmation.
Yep, yes, according to Google, we are live streaming to YouTube. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. All right, we are going to go ahead and get started, and I'm going to ask Commissioner Stroman from the Department of Natural Resources to start us off this afternoon.
Great. Well, thank you, Mariah. Good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to the third meeting of the Governor's Advisory Council on Climate Change. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Sarah Stroman. I'm the Commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. And I do want to note that Minnesota Pollution Control Agency Commissioner Laura Bishop, who chairs the Climate Subcabinet, regrets that she is unable to attend today's meeting. She sends her regards, but I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to be here today in her place. I want to thank our advisory council members for the generosity of your time and your expertise, and it's great to see you all today. I also want to express appreciation for our two speakers who are with us here today. We welcome Secretary Ben Grumbles from the Maryland Department of the Environment, and Sarah Duffy, the Manager of Government Affairs for US and Canada with the Climate Group and the Under 2 Coalition. And I want to thank them for sharing their thoughts and experiences with us today. And finally, I want to welcome the members of the public who are viewing our live stream, as well as any state joining us today. This kind of coming together.
Just to make the introduction and then hand off, I think it's been a couple of years now since we were in.
We're hearing some background noise, so we might need folks to mute themselves. Let's try again, Commissioner.
Perfect. Yeah, I just wanted to pause since I know we're live streaming. It's difficult then for people to hear two conversations. So I was just starting to say that this kind of coming together, I think, is really the ideal way and really probably the only way to address the formidable challenge of climate change, and to do that work in a way that creates new opportunities. And for those of you who listened to Governor Walz's State of the State address last night, in one of his remarks, he noted that we, meaning Minnesota, we're the problem-solving headquarters of the country. And that really resonated with me. I totally agree with that. And I think that this group is part of that and part of the reason why we are the problem-solving headquarters of the country. Today, the Advisory Council's work groups will kick off, and I will note that as DNR Commissioner, I'm really pleased to see that one of the three groups is on natural and working lands. At DNR, we know that there are many opportunities to use our natural and working lands in ways that not only sequester carbon and create resiliency, but also that produce co-benefits, such as improving soil and water health and creating new jobs throughout Minnesota. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion and the work today. And with that, I will turn it back to our facilitator, Mariah Levison.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you for being here with us today. So you all know me, but again, I'm Mariah Levison, helping to facilitate today. So I'm going to go through the agenda and then hear from each of you. So today, after we do some introductions, we'll hear from Frank Kolash from the Pollution Control Agency to give us an update on some of the climate policy proposals that we heard about at our last meeting and how those are progressing through the legislature. After that, we'll hear from Secretary Ben Grumbles from the Maryland Department of the Environment about Maryland's experience working on climate, their learnings, and the keys to their successes. We'll take a short break. After that, we'll hear from another speaker, Sarah Duffy, who is the Manager of Government Affairs for the US and Canada of the Climate Group and the Under 2 Coalition. And she'll be talking to us about how other subnational jurisdictions around the world have made progress in spite of challenges. After that, we'll have some time as our advisory group to discuss the work groups that we're going to break into later. So we'll discuss where we are with those, and then we'll close our public meeting, and then we'll go into our breakout groups so that we have some time to start working together and talk about how our work groups are going to work together. We'll come back together for any final questions and wrap up our meeting for the day. Any questions from advisory council members about our meeting today? All right, just a couple of those reminders that I always go over some of those best practices for virtual meetings, things we're all more than familiar with at this point, but we really appreciate, as this group always does, that folks keep their cameras on so that we can have more of a sense of being together and so that the public can feel more engaged with us, given that our meeting today is streaming. As a reminder, if you can't see everyone's faces, if you go up to those three little dots where it says more actions and you choose the large gallery view, that'll give you more people's faces to see. We also really encourage you to dialogue with each other during the meeting, so that can be using the chat, it can be raising your hands, or it can be just speaking up at any time. We want to have as much dialogue and back and forth as we possibly can in this format. Yeah, those are my reminders. And again, always to mute when you're not speaking. It does look like we have a hand raised. Let's see. Alex.
Hi, everyone. I actually did have a question. Have you thought about when we might actually be able to meet in person rather than on Zoom in light of the increase in the number of people getting vaccinated?
Yeah, we know as the state that we're not resuming much in the way of in-person meetings until the middle of the summer. So our tentative thinking is that our next meeting would be virtual, and then from there, we'll probably be checking in with all of you about meeting in person and what that might look like, assuming no surprises or changes. So that's our tentative thinking on that. Any feedback or thoughts about that from all of you?
That makes sense.
Well, we will keep checking in with you on that. And I, for one, would very much like for us to meet in person as soon as we think that is safe. We know that will mean travel for some of you, so we'll have to work on schedules for all of that. Any other questions about the logistics or our agenda for the day? All right, then we're gonna just do one go around just so that you all have a chance to hear from each other to get us started. We know you know each other, but for the benefit of the public, if you would share your name, your affiliation, and then just for fun, share something inspiring that you've read, watched, or listened to recently. And just for time efficiency, I'm just gonna call on you in alphabetical order. So we have Khalif first. And Khalif, you're on mute if you wanna hit your mute button there.
Thank you once again for giving me this opportunity to be the first person to speak.
Khalif, it's a bit hard for me to hear you. Yeah, others are nodding too. If you could speak up a little bit, that'd be great.
Can you hear me right now?
It's still soft. We can hear you, but not great. So if that's the best, don't worry about it. But just do your best.
Let me try if I can raise my. Can you hear me right now?
That's better. Great.
Yep. My name's Khalif Ahmed Bashir. I'm a resident of Wilmar, Minnesota. That's on the west central part of the city. I am currently working, as I said earlier, with a Genio Turkey as a supervisor, a production company that is dealing with the turkey and chicken. Yep. So I'm a member of Governance Advisory Council. And I think that is all I have to say for today.
Thank you, Khalif. Next, we have Mike Birkland.
Good afternoon. I am Mike Birkland, and I'm with Minnesota Forest Industries and Minnesota Timber Producers Association. As I like to say, I represent the folks who work in the woods and in the mills in Minnesota, and we play an important and significant role in combating climate change just with our natural infrastructure that's out there and available in the woods and the trees that we grow. I guess as far as something inspirational, recently I just finished a couple of really good books. Extreme Ownership. I forget the name of the author of the book. Just a book about, just the challenges of leadership, and this from a military perspective from a couple of former Navy SEALs. And then another book that was really really worth a read, and I highly commend and recommend it to you. It's called The Book of Mistakes. 9 Secrets to Creating a Successful Future, one of those deals. But anyway, it's really an encouraging and uplifting book, and well worth the time, and it's a pretty quick read. So I'll pass along that from an inspiration standpoint. Hope it helps. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Next, we have Chris Clark.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Clark. I'm president of Xcel Energy Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. And for something inspirational, I recently enjoyed an article or a series of articles in the New York Times about bringing clean energy to transportation and how we need to not just replace vehicles with either electric or clean fueled vehicles, but how we actually need to rethink how to make the transportation system sustainable. So had plenty of challenges it outlined, but I found it to be also inspirational in looking at what some other countries have done to be successful in this regard. Looking forward to today's discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. Eric?
I'm Eric Dayton, co-founder and CEO of ASCO Finlayson, and just starting a biography on FDR. So I'll let you know how it goes.
Wayne?
Good afternoon. I'm Wayne Dupuis. I'm from the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. And inspiration, I just finished a book called Grandmother's Counsel. And in it, they kind of recommend that we become intimately familiar or aware with one aspect of nature, maybe an animal, a plant, or even constellations, and take a part of your day, every day, to become aware. And in that respect, we become closer and better relationship with our surroundings. Thank you.
Thank you. Marco?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Marco Hernandez. I use he, they pronouns. I'm the public policy director here at Copal, as well as a board member on the Minnesota Council on Latino Affairs. And I would say what gave me inspiration recently is the environmental coalition that I lead, in which right now with the legislature, you know, it's weird with Minnesota being the only legislature in the country that's split. And so when it comes to advocating for bills, it's just weird to know that like, oh, like my bill is not going to make it. And so we're transitioning from the legislative process to more direct actions and starting to work with environmental activists from across the state to build a narrative for next year's legislative session. So that's what gave me inspiration for today. And yeah, look forward to this meeting with you all today too.
Thanks, Marco. Lucinda?
Sorry, I have rural broadband, and as a result, I don't have a lot of ability to do video. So I'm Lucinda Johnson, University of Minnesota, Duluth Natural Resources Research Institute, and I'm reading a couple of books right now. One is called Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the other is Bill Gates' book.
Thank you. Alex?
Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Klass. I'm a law professor at the University of Minnesota Law School, focusing in on energy law, natural resources law, and environmental law. In terms of inspiring things I'm reading or watching, I'm reading Elizabeth Kolbert's new book, Under a White Sky. She's one of the premier climate writers in the country, and this particular book, her other one was The Sixth Extinction, which won the Pulitzer Prize, but this one is looking at all of the kind of technological developments and scientific developments to deal with climate change adaptation, loss of species, and just seeing the type of scientific study of corals and gene editing is quite inspiring. And I'm also watching the Genius series, the mini series on various people, but I'm watching the one on Aretha Franklin and learning so much about her and her work in the civil rights movement, and just and obviously in her music as well. So those are my two.
Thank you. Pat?
Hi, I'm Pat Luneman, dairy farmer from Todd County. And I've been a leader in the dairy industry for a number of years. I'm kind of on the backside of that. And also on Minnesota AgriGrowth, was chair for 3 years of that. So I have a broad knowledge of ag in Minnesota. Something inspiring, the Minnesota Chamber just came out a week or so ago with a report on the need for immigrants in Minnesota. And I was featured in that report, and actually the Star Tribune as a lead editorial recommended reading that report. And I just, I've been working on the immigration issue, the need for immigrants for well over a decade, and, it's time to get something done. And I would encourage others to read the report, and hopefully it's inspirational that the business community is behind the effort for the need for immigrants. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Anne?
Hi, I'm with the Nature Conservancy in Minnesota, North and South Dakota. Glad to be here today. And a couple of things, some have been mentioned, but I'll just, our new chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy, Catherine Hayhoe, has a series of pretty incredible TED Talks and articles on climate change. And I've been spending some time engaged with those and find them really inspiring. So thanks.
Micah?
Hi, thanks for, it's great to be here today. So my name is Micah Nierman. I'm an internal medicine and pediatrics physician, and I currently work at Gillette as the chief medical officer. And so it's terrific to be a part of this group. And then more recently, I had the opportunity to read a manuscript that will go to publication soon called Pure Grit. It's a collection of short stories about people with physical disabilities who've gone on to be very successful professionals and Paralympians. So that's it.
Great, thank you. Kevin?
Marketing manager with LIONA, Minnesota, and North Dakota. We represent more than 12,000 construction laborers and their families, about a third of whom work in energy and fuels related jobs. Very excited to be part of this group as our landscape is transforming for our members, not only work in energy, but in other areas like infrastructure. And I am sad to say that I have not been doing very much book reading over the last couple of years, except maybe fiction. But I find probably the most helpful thing is trying to read Energy Wire every morning, basically, like before starting, just to keep track of all the changes that are happening in sort of technologies and policy and everything around the country, which feels like a lot to keep up with.
And that's why I said read, watch, or listen. Could be a podcast, a show. As someone who has little kids, I get the not a lot of books and thing. Hilda.
Hi, everybody. I'm sorry, I have some video issues, so I cannot turn my camera. I'm really sorry about that. Well, I'm Hilda Martinez. I'm a consultant and something inspirational. I just finished reading the Dr. Mark Jackson from Stanford University book. The one is 100% clean, renewable energy and storage for everything. And what it inspired me is that he really see a future with no fossil fuels. Like he really demonstrates that with wind, solar, and hydro, we will be able to power everything by 2050. So I think it's really inspirational to have those kind of books and analysis in this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Anne.
Hi there, Anne Schlegel. I'm a farmer in western Minnesota, primarily grain farmer, and I also have a little bit of livestock. I have small kids and I don't have much time for reading. Most of my reading ends up being kind of for pleasure, for escapism. But what does inspire me is I've been working with a group of growers here in the upper Midwest, organizing ourselves around the growth of perennial grains, specifically Kernza from the University of Minnesota, to kind of help work to perennialize the landscape. And every Monday morning we meet, and I always get a lot of energy, batteries recharged by meeting with those growers, because they are doing kind of cutting edge, exciting work on the landscape and making real impacts in their communities and on our potential to impact climate change in a positive manner.
And the last person to go, but the first person to join us on the call today, Dave Sunderman.
Hi, Dave Sunderman. I work at Benko Electric Cooperative. We're part of Great River Energy as our generation and transmission company, and MREA, our statewide association. And I guess one big happening, at least in the last month or so, was what all transpired down in Texas and with ERCOT, and how our MISO North really performed, and very proud of the system operators and the ability to work through those situations. But I did just purchase a book, pull it up here, get the title correct, The Code Breaker, and I think that'll be very interesting to read. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing a little bit of inspiration, and I think it's just a nice way to start a meeting, get to see and hear from everybody. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Frank Kolash, who's the Director for Climate at MPCA, to give us some updates on those policy proposals.
Thank you, Mariah, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, especially to our advisory council members and the time that you put in to assist us with the climate change work. So I will go ahead and begin sharing my screen. And if someone can verify that you can see the slides.
We can, Frank.
Great, very good, thank you. So as terms of introductions, again, my name is Frank Kolash. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the Climate Director for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, primarily assisting Commissioner Bishop on Executive Order 1937, the Climate Change Executive Order, including the Climate Change Subcabinet, and working with all of you on the Advisory Council. So what I'll be going over today is a bit of information about what was in the governor's budget and policy proposals for 2021. And it was unfortunate that at our last meeting, it was one day before the budget was announced, so we couldn't talk to you in many details about what was exactly in that proposal, but we'll be able to go over that more in this presentation, and I plan to leave time for questions if you have those. And I know that there are representatives from many of the agencies that have budget proposals if we have more detailed questions for them. So to start very quickly, where we are at, this has been finalized since our last meeting, and this is where we are with the overall greenhouse gas emissions in Minnesota. The emissions went up in 2018 compared to 2016, and so we are going the wrong direction. We did not meet the 2015 goal. We're not on track to meet the 2025 goal. And I'll note that that increase was not totally surprising for us, because we were seeing data coming out at the national and international level that was showing that expecting emissions to be going up during this time frame. So breaking it down into where are the emissions coming from, again, I believe we shared this type of slide with you in November, and this provides the various major sectors of the economy that have emissions that we group around, with transportation being the largest source of emissions, followed by electric generation, agriculture, forestry, and land use. All of those have some sort of reduction, but with transportation, agriculture, forestry, and land use, not enough reduction to put us on track for the goals. We are seeing that the electric generation sector is on track to meet the 2025 goals. We continue to see announcements and progress being made in decarbonizing our electric generation sector. So what we're looking for are the opportunities to use that clean energy in these other sectors. Within the industrial, residential, and commercial sectors, we are seeing a lot of those emissions are coming from the use of natural gas and other fossil fuels for building heating and also some process heating. And those three sectors, when added up, are on par with the other large sectors. And with each of those, we are actually seeing emissions increase in Minnesota going forward. And then we do have a reasonable reduction in the waste sector. It is a very small part of our emissions inventory. This chart shows a little bit of a different breakout for the agriculture, forestry, and land use, and this is to help us frame some of the discussions and some of the ideas that are going forward and initiatives that were approved in the governor's budget. And it's just pulling out agriculture, which includes the emissions from crop agriculture and animal agriculture, also clearly shows that forestry and forest resources in Minnesota have an opportunity to be a carbon storage for Minnesota to reduce the emissions from that area. And then within the land use, that's really primarily looking at the emissions that come from soils that are eroded off of the land and end up in our waters and end up with emissions to the atmosphere, especially of nitrous oxides, as they are processed, biogeochemically processed in lake and stream sediments. So starting with the largest sector, the transportation sector, and again, a 7% reduction since 2005. The primary items that we're working here, and everything except for the top item, is a legislative proposal in the governor's budget. The first item is on par for the Pollution Control Agency to implement the Clean Car Standard. And the progress on that has been that we held hearings in front of an administrative law judge on February 22nd and February 23rd. The public comment period ended on March 15th, and now we are awaiting the report from the administrative law judge as that rulemaking continues its process. And then within the governor's budget, there are a number of items that were proposed by MnDOT, and that one of them included a stakeholder process to develop a clean fuels policy. And that was based on work both at the climate change sub-cabinet level, but also MnDOT's Sustainable Transportation Advisory Council, and also the Governor's Biofuels Council, identifying this as a way to reduce the carbon intensity of all of the fuels that we use, including expanding the use of biofuels and making better opportunities for electrification. Then within MnDOT's budget, they also are seeking funding to expand Minnesota's EV charging network. And part of that is to use some of the $75 fee that goes to that is charged to someone who owns a battery electric vehicle, fully electric vehicle, that is meant to offset some of the lost revenue for since those vehicles don't require any gasoline, they don't pay any gas tax, and looking to use some of that money in order to expand our EV charging network, just directly support those electric vehicles that are paying that registration fee. And then also MnDOT has some request in their budget to expand EV charging at their facilities, which will help them transition as much as they can with as many of the vehicles as it makes sense for to electrification for their vehicles and their fleet moving forward. And then they've also seeking funding for what they call district level energy efficiency and renewable energy investments. And that's to make sure that their buildings and processes and all of the uses that they have for energy, they're as most efficient as possible, and they're using as much renewable energy as possible when they operate their buildings and operations. And then the Department of Agriculture has about $4 million in the budget requesting to support biofuels infrastructure funding, and that's to support the upgrading of tanks and pumping systems in Minnesota so that we can support higher blends of ethanol going forward in Minnesota, because a number of the current facilities are not able and not rated to be able to store and pump higher blends of ethanol in Minnesota. So then moving to the electric generation sector, these are primarily policy items, except for the final item on this list. But the governor is seeking through the Department of Commerce, in conjunction with the House in the legislature, to adopt 100% clean energy standard by 2040. And embedded within that is a change to Minnesota's renewable energy standard to try to encourage the cleanest electricity for Minnesota going forward. Another part of that proposal is to prioritize clean energy first, and that's looking at when the regulated utilities in Minnesota are looking to add generation or replace generation in Minnesota, that first the evaluation goes to clean energy or renewable energy before we start looking at fossil fuel generation as that replacement or addition to the generation mix. The Department of Commerce is also seeking the Energy Conservation and Optimization Bill. This is the one bill that is making progress currently in both houses, and has moved out of committees and is heading to floor consideration in both houses. And that's updating the conservation work, the strong energy efficiency work that the state of Minnesota has had since 2007, moving ahead and avoiding the need to generate more electricity. And then Commerce is also seeking to address the building side for a reduction goal for the existing buildings, setting a 50% reduction by 2035 goal. And that's really focused around how do we increase the conservation, increase the energy efficiency, and also potentially address some of the disparities that exist with buildings in Minnesota. And then the one small budget item is that the Department of Labor and Industry is seeking funding to assist their work as they go on the path of updating our commercial and large multifamily housing building codes, and using a contractor to assist with the evaluation that's required by state law, and be able to update those more on a 3-year basis with a target for net zero by 2036 for those sectors. Then looking at the agriculture, forestry, and land use, this has been the area that received the most approved funding in the budget that we are requesting from the legislature. And we're very proud that we're working on this particular area moving ahead. So within the budget items, the Department of Agriculture requested money to expand their ag water quality certification program and create a climate smart farms project, and funding to develop that and then be able to roll that out going forward in the next few years here. The next one is actually not from the Department of Agriculture. I will fix this slide before we send these out for your review and for your records. That is actually from the Board of Water and Soil Resources. They are seeking a significant amount of money to go to land managers and farmers around climate mitigation and soil health via their agricultural cover crop initiative. And that's primarily grants going out to the people that are working on the land to adopt land management practices that will benefit the climate and build soil health. And then the Department of Natural Resources is also seeking significant amount of fundings to accelerate our tree planting to capture carbon on our landscapes and in our forests in Minnesota. Part of that includes expanding our sapling structure so that we can be able to grow the right types of trees that we need to expand the tree planting, and then also put those trees out on our landscape and be able to start storing that carbon with targets of 5 million tons of carbon being stored on our landscape in the coming years. So looking at the industrial, residential, and commercial sectors, as I said, individually, they all are smaller, but when we add those up, we get to a rather significant source, and they are going up since 2005, and mostly due to the use of fossil fuels for space heating or process heating. And so again, here we're tying in the Department of Commerce's work on identifying a % reduction goal for existing buildings, and then the Department of Labor and Industry, their work to accelerate our adoption of commercial and large multifamily building codes for a net zero target by 2036. And then looking at where we are at with resiliency and adaptation, the Pollution Control Agency has in our budget request a just under $3 million to establish a climate adaptation and resiliency grant program. And this would be targeted at cities, counties, tribal governments, and other local entities to be able to do their climate resiliency assessments, to be able to understand what parts of their infrastructure are most at risk from the coming changes that we expect with the climate, and be able to prepare for that, and then also be able to prepare the design elements and other items so that they can pull those into the bonding process in Minnesota. And since many of these projects would be publicly funded in public buildings, that we would be able to have those assessments done and the designs done and be able to put those into the bonding so that we can accelerate the building of resiliency and adaptation at our local level. And then the Board of Soil and Water Resources is also looking at the climate adaptation, water storage, and treatment grant program, where they would be providing funds to, again, land managers and particularly for farmers and working their crop agricultural lands in order for ways to be able to store more water on the landscape that helps build the soil health and helps avoid water quality issues and climate issues and reduce some of the emissions, but also be able to address what we are expecting with more precipitation happening and trying to avoid flooding of agricultural lands. And then also within the policy items in our proposal are sustainability goals for the cabinet agencies and also some other cabinet agency work that's going ahead. And so the Department of Admin is seeking a policy change to ensure that we are achieving and striving for climate efficiency at all of our state agencies, the cabinet agencies moving forward. So through the Office of Enterprise Sustainability, making sure that state government is modeling the way and achieving emission reductions for greenhouse gases, water quality savings and water use savings, solid waste reductions, and also energy efficiency and more use of renewable energy in our operations. And then similarly, the Department of Administration is also seeking to clarify and enhance the sustainability standards for the cabinet agencies moving forward. These final two items are not legislative proposals, but they are work that's going on through the Environmental Quality Board, and that includes work that's going ahead right now to look for revisions to the environmental assessment worksheet form to include greenhouse gas emissions in those evaluations so that that information is available to the decision makers on projects that require an environmental assessment worksheet. And also the Environmental Quality Board is looking at new mandatory environmental impact statement categories based on greenhouse gas emissions going forward, so that we are making sure that we are giving analysis and the appropriate analysis and considerations to new projects that need approvals and qualify for these categories related to climate and especially their greenhouse gas emissions. So this is the package that we presented to the governor and was approved for submission in the budget. The total budget items are just under $15 million for the budget items that we requested. And then also we have the policy bills that don't have any particular budget item included to them. And so we're continuing to use this plan as we expand our engagement and work to talk to more Minnesotans and identify ways that we can achieve success with these programs at the legislature and continue to reduce our emissions and address the existential crisis that is climate change. And then we continue to leverage the work of multiple efforts to reduce emissions and build that resiliency, including the work of the Climate Change Subcabinet, the work of this Advisory Council, the work of the Governor's Council on Biofuels, their recommendations, the recommendations that came out of the Sustainable Transportation Advisory Council, and then also we're on the adaptation and resiliency piece, working with partners, including the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership. And with that, that is my presentation, and I will open up the microphone for questions.
Any questions for Frank on what those policies are or the status of them?
Hello, this is Mike.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yep, thank you. Say, Frank, just toward the end there of the presentation, you outlined a few of the groups that we'll all be working with. I guess another one I think that is really kind of going along on a parallel path that's doing some important work is the Minnesota Forest Resources Council, another governor-appointed body. So, especially with the synchronicity with forests and carbon. So, I just highly commend that group to you as we consider paths forward as well, and collectively working together and trying to achieve outcomes that make sense for all involved.
Great, thank you for that comment, Mike. And I know that the Department of Natural Resources is excited to be working with that group also to identify the way we can use our Minnesota's forests and forest resources in climate solutions.
We have Alex with a hand raised.
Thanks for a really good presentation. On the building decarbonization side, since that's a sector where carbon emissions are unfortunately increasing, what's been the focus on building electrification? I hear about that in a lot of states, a lot of other states moving away from natural gas, increased electrification. Obviously, in a cold weather climate, there's more challenges associated with that. But I'd be interested in knowing what sort of specific proposals, actions, whether it be new regulations, legislation, is happening specifically on that front.
Yes, and I also see that Aditya Ranad from the Department of Commerce is on. So Aditya, if you'd also like to add in, but I can say that part of that electrification discussion is happening within the Energy Conservation Optimization Bill and the ability to look at what's called fuel switching. So not just focus on increasing the energy efficiency, but also the opportunity to make switches, and as particularly for the use of electrification in both hot water heating and in space heating. And some of that technology is being developed now, and the efficiencies are getting more useful in locations like Minnesota. And there are a number of stakeholder groups that are looking at the best ways to move forward with that. It is one of the more challenging areas because all those decisions are made at an individual level with individual homeowners. But I think that it's also part of the discussion that we have within the building codes structure and looking for ways that, especially with commercial and the large multifamily housing, that we can use those areas where the proposers and the builders are usually on a larger scale and be able to get some of that technology demonstration happening in Minnesota. But that's clearly electrification for space heating and hot water heating in Minnesota is clearly an important discussion. And we continue to work within our action team there to see how we can build that out into Minnesota and really then leverage the clean energy that's being developed by our electric generation sector.
Yeah, and Frank, if I can add a couple of things, by including it as one of the options available for fuel switching, we can make which is how we have laid it out in energy conservation and optimization. We can make sure that it's economically efficient. We feel that that's a better approach than mandating a certain level of electrification. The second thing the Department of Commerce is doing is we're hosting roundtables on industrial electrification for different applications. And this is a Department of Energy grant that we have, and Anthony Fryer from Department of Commerce is hosting these roundtables. So we're happy to provide you more details on what the conclusions of those are.
Thank you, Aditya. And Kevin, I'm going to ask you to hold your question and we'll circle back to it shortly because we have Secretary Grumbles here and I imagine he has other things on his schedule later in the day. So thank you in advance, Kevin, and we'll come back to you. Frank, you want to transition over to Secretary Grumbles?
Sure. At this time, I will hand the microphone off to Deputy Commissioner at the Pollution Control Agency, Peter Tester, to introduce Secretary Grumbles.
Good afternoon, everyone. Ben, are you on and able to hear us?
I'm on.
Great.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Good.
So Ben is Maryland's Secretary of the Environment, a position he's held since 2015, and he also chairs the Governor of Maryland's Chesapeake Bay Cabinet, the Maryland Climate Change Commission. He served as the regional administrator for RGGI, which is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and he's also worked across the spectrum in federal government at the US EPA. He's worked for the Legislative House of Representatives. So he really has a broad swath of experience in his jobs, and much of that, if not all, has been in the environmental energy sector side and has done a lot of work on climate change issues in the regional area of the Mid-Atlantic states that I think will be of interest to folks. He also is the Vice President of the Environmental Council of the State, so that's the environmental agencies of all 50 states, and he's been very active. And in that sense, he also gets a chance to take a look at what the best practices are happening across the whole country and what's working in different areas. So I think we're in for a treat to be able to hear him. In particular, and I don't know if he'll focus in on this, but he does a lot of work with other states in the Mid-Atlantic on some very innovative work, not just on RGGI, but I know that he's spearheaded a lot of work on offshore wind with Virginia and North Carolina. He's worked with the Georgetown Climate Center on a number of initiatives in a way that has a much broader impact than other folks in other states that are more internally focused. So with that, Ben, thank you for joining us and look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks for your great work at ECOS and for that very kind introduction. And apologies to Kevin. I don't know you, but I sense that I prevented you from getting your question asked. So I'm already starting off on a bad foot with you. But listen, it's very inspiring to hear from all of you. And it is amazing how similar, perspectives and priorities that Maryland has in aligning with Minnesota. It is inspiring. And what isn't in my bio is I have some Minnesota roots of my own that I'm very proud of. I worked for 15 years up on Capitol Hill in the House Public Works and Transportation Committee for former Congressman Arlen Stangland from the Northwest, Colin Peterson's predecessor, and also worked extremely closely on a bipartisan basis with Jim Oberstar. And so for many years, I focused on Minnesota national policies that benefit Minnesota in water and environment and agriculture and transportation. So I have a brief slide presentation that I just wanted to share with you all about the Climate Change Commission that is in Maryland that's very similar to yours in many respects, but I want to talk about how important the governance and the personal relationships and the public support can be towards finding common ground for the common good. And that's been our approach with the Climate Change Commission. If you could go to the next slide. On the right is a copy of our annual report, this year's report that was issued in December, and that's not Lake Superior, but also equally cherished for us in Maryland is the Chesapeake Bay, the nation's largest estuary. Climate change is water change. So one of the driving forces, in addition to the greenhouse gas emissions and air quality components of our climate change strategies, are understanding that, connecting the dots and the drops and the watts and the impacts on our precious water systems. But the commission is, as you can read, it's very independent. I chair the commission. Now there are 8 state agencies that report to the governor that are on the commission, but the commission is robustly diverse with voices and perspectives from some very strong environmental advocacy organizations, businesses, energy sector, the Farm Bureau, scientific and academic community, and state and local government. So the key to finding common ground and getting to know one another and connecting the dots is through diversity and robust interaction. The commissioners are appointed largely more by the legislature, the Senate, and President and Speaker of the House, but also the governor has 3 positions to appoint. And this was all based on an executive order that was then codified into law. But the commission is very popular and very well respected. And here, to get to the nuts and bolts of it, it's very important that the commission devolve into work groups, or, if you're a legislative creature, subcommittees. And these are the working groups: mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, which I can tell you is extremely robust, and diversity of views. The adaptation and resiliency working group, which is growing more and more momentum since the commission really got going in 2015, the added importance of adaptation and resiliency, particularly given that Maryland has over 3,000 miles of shoreline at risk. Yes, we are a very small state with a small population, 6 million people. But because of the undulating and interwoven coastlines of the Bay and the Atlantic Ocean, we have a tremendous amount of shoreline. The scientific and technical working group is largely academic people. We have a few state agency scientists, but it's largely through the universities with diversity and disciplines to tackle some of the emerging and ongoing scientific and technical solutions types of issues. And then an outreach and communication education work group that helps schedule public events where we learn from and listen to and convey information to people young and old to get their views on climate change challenges and solutions in Maryland. We do seek consensus recommendations. On some topics, it gets very hard to find consensus. And in those, we strive for consensus as much as possible. And we submit a comprehensive report that includes recommendations and the state of the science and a healthy chapter, healthy in terms of detail on what's happening at the federal level. And that has significantly changed over the last several years, as you know. Next slide, please. Okay, so the most recent report, just a few things to flag for you, and very similar types of topics that you are tackling as well in Minnesota. But maybe the most comprehensive coverage yet of our annual report, I've been chairing the commission since 2015, is an emphasis on environmental justice. Now, we call it climate justice because we also have a state commission on environmental justice and sustainable communities, which focuses in on broader types of inequities and underserved and overburdened communities. Climate justice, we try to focus in a little bit with more specificity for the Climate Change Commission, is on overburdened and underserved communities with a tie-in and a connection to greenhouse gas emissions. It could be energy injustice, or it could be communities that have, because of the increasing climate situation with wetter, warmer, wilder weather in the mid-Atlantic, more flooding, more sewage in basements and streets, more risk of sea level rise. And so the commission report is to really put a greater emphasis, in fact, a vice chair of climate justice to help connect the dots among the different working groups, particularly mitigation and adaptation. A big high-profile recommendation, which was immediately taken up by the General Assembly, which convened in January of 2021 and is currently debating the comprehensive greenhouse gas reduction law, is to update the state's current greenhouse gas reduction goal. The current goal is 25% reduction by 2020, which we are definitely, we are meeting that. But the latest recommendation in the law was to increase our greenhouse gas reductions 40% using a 2006 baseline by 2030. The Commission's report, based on extensive analysis, compromise, and collaboration, and detailed modeling and number crunching, was that we could strive for a 50% greenhouse gas reduction by 2030, and even more boldly, have a stretch goal of net zero emissions by 2045. Now, coming from a diverse and independent group like the Climate Change Commission, that immediately got a lot of attention and traction in the General Assembly and in the governor's office. So something along these lines is what I expect to get through the legislature in the next several weeks. Here's something that I think is really important to everyone involved in climate change or on an advisory committee for the governor and the legislature and for citizens at large. and that is to focus increasingly on metrics and indicators for adaptation and resiliency. So we're putting some scientific rigor into that. So the recommendation was to try to finalize some numbers to measure, I kind of joke and say as like a bumper sticker slogan, our state should be twice as sturdy by 2030. What in the heck does that mean? How do you measure increased resiliency? Our Maryland Emergency Management Administration, our Department of Natural Resources, which just like in Minnesota is heavily involved in climate-related work, particularly adaptation and resiliency, is working on that front, particularly towards coastal resiliency. And then also our scientific and technical working group is focused in on this phrase and the possibilities of blue carbon. And that specifically, as your colleagues from the Nature Conservancy and the environmental community know very well, is this notion of getting a win-win by restoring coastal wetlands in particular, and protecting coastal wetlands. You're not only increasing resiliency and adaptation possibilities, but you are also significantly increasing carbon sequestration. These are known as the blue carbon projects. So wetlands and also forests are a big part of the carbon sequestration work in the state, which obviously is hugely important for Minnesota as well. Next slide. So here's one slide, which is kind of scary with a lot of numbers on it. I'll leave it for you to look at in your quote unquote leisure. But this is getting at the magic ingredient of being successful, finding a real climate progress in the state of Maryland, ambition and achievability. The state law not only pushes us towards a 40% by 2030 goal, and I'm predicting it'll be 50% by the time the legislature finishes in the next several weeks or month. But the magic ingredient is to require the Department of the Environment to model and track in close coordination with our Department of Commerce and with every other department in the state and local governments the economic impacts. So as a matter of law, we are required to track, as we are striving to meet our ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goals, we must also look at can we achieve a net positive impact to jobs and to the economy. And so the numbers below you will see as part of our almost 200-page Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act plan that we issued several months ago, a lot of modeling and number crunching to come up with jobs estimates, impacts on the economy, and the social cost of carbon, or I guess now it may turn out to be the social cost of greenhouse gases. But this is very important because if we determine that we're not making progress on the jobs and the economy front and not able to demonstrate it, it can lead to a recommendation to the General Assembly to revise the ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goals. Okay, next slide, please. This is my last slide, and that's an applause line for some of you, I'm sure. But the emphasis is on regional collaborations. Maryland is a relatively small state surrounded by a lot of people and a lot of other states, is often is a downstream state and also a downwind state. For purposes of our climate progress, a big key to our success is working in regional collaborations. So there are three examples here. One of them many of you know about or have heard about. It's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. It started over about 11 years ago. It is not an interstate compact. That would require constitutional and congressional consent. It is instead a model program where there are 11 states that are implementing their own laws to follow a general framework, a model framework to use auctions, a market, to cap greenhouse gas emissions from the energy sector, from coal-fired power plants and natural gas plants of a certain size, where those facilities would then have to purchase allowances on a quarterly basis through an auction. So we say it's not a tax, it's not even a fee, it's an environmental compliance mechanism where the power plants need to purchase additional allowances, but through a market-based approach. And then the very popular part of it is the proceeds are then distributed to the states, and the states can invest those proceeds as they see fit. And most of them, like in Maryland, it's for energy efficiency, but and renewable energy, other public goods for the environment. Or as in Maryland, almost half of the proceeds are for ratepayer subsidy, direct ratepayer assistance to ensure that electricity rates are kept low. And they have. And so this is not meant to be a pep rally for RGGI, but this is one of the examples why Maryland has been ranked as one of the most successful states in the country in reducing greenhouse gas emissions while growing jobs in the economy. And I'm very much aware that Minnesota is in the MISO, not in the PJM power grid, but the RGGI model is working and growing. Pennsylvania is striving to enter, and North Carolina maybe in the future as well. The other two bullets relate to transportation, which is hugely significant in every state as an opportunity for greenhouse gas reductions and connecting people and life's opportunities so that transportation mobility is also increased. And Governor Hogan of Maryland, Republican governor, signed in last July, along with 14 other states in the District of Columbia, an agreement to strive towards not just zero emission light duty vehicles, but specifically in this case for medium and heavy duty trucks and buses. So this is going to be a very important opportunity for us, and it's also very much an environmental justice initiative, because in so many cases, particularly in our urban areas and along busy roads, the emissions from trucks and buses affect low income and disadvantaged communities the most. And then the last one, which is a really big idea that is still evolving and under development, is to follow a RGGI, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative model, specifically for the transportation sector. So again, this is not an interstate compact, it's a collaboration among states to see if a cap and invest type of model could apply. So it currently, the collaboration involves about a dozen states in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic, including Maryland, that are trying to figure out how such a market-based approach could reduce emissions from on-road diesel and gasoline, exempting farm equipment, and growing, getting proceeds for more equitable and cleaner transportation in each of the states that would participate. So far, only 4 states have agreed specifically to begin the actual program, but the other 8 states are looking at that to see how it will work. In any way, I wanted to, that's getting into a little more detail than you asked for. But the key is to have a commission, advisors with staff from different agencies, and recognize that it takes time to find common ground, but it really will improve the policy throughout the state on climate change and connecting energy, transportation, natural and working lands, commerce, and other sectors that all have important roles to play. Hey, Frank and Mariah, thanks all of you so much for the opportunity to talk at you for a while. I'm happy to take some questions, or Frank, as you probably know, my top climate guy or person for the state who also serves the Climate Change Commission is Chris Hoagland, chris.hoagland@maryland.gov. Anyway, I'd be happy to take any questions from Kevin or anyone else.
Great. Our first question is from Ann Mulholland.
Hi, Ben. It's great to meet you. Ann Mulholland with the Nature Conservancy in Minnesota, North and South Dakota. I'm curious if you all you focused a lot on the economics, which I'm very impressed with. And I'm curious if you all did an economic impact statement or report on your climate plan. And if so, if you might recommend something like that for Minnesota.
Yes, thank you so much. And the Nature Conservancy is well represented on our Climate Change Commission as well in Maryland. I wouldn't call it a economic impact statement like an EIS, but we did have throughout the 200-page report, like last year, economic analysis on modeling. I showed you on one of the slides a small chart that put numbers to revenue and GDP for the state and jobs and impacts. So we have quite a bit of detail on that. What I'll do is I'll have Chris Hoagland, Frank, you can help me on this. I'll have Chris Hoagland send it to you or other members of your advisory committee on the economic components. And as a matter of state law, we are required to do the number crunching throughout our report for the greenhouse gas reduction plan for the state. There are two reports, okay, for the state of Maryland. One is the 200-page greenhouse gas emissions reduction plan, which requires economic and jobs analysis as we try to meet 40 by 30 or now 50 by 30. The other report, which I gave you a few highlights of, was from the advisory committee itself, the Maryland Climate Change Commission, which also touches on the economics and jobs, but gives broader recommendations relating to adaptation, resiliency, emerging science questions, and education and outreach.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. All right.
Other questions for Secretary Grumbles?
Mariah, I will jump in and thank you, Secretary Grumbles, for your talk here, and certainly looking forward to conversing with Chris Hoagland. And certainly if you send me that information, I will make sure that the Advisory Council receives that. One question that I had coming to mind is you spoke about how the commission, when it issues its reports and recommendations, they're taken very seriously at both your legislature and your governor's office. What did you find was most influential to build that trust and reputation and respect for the commission so that their recommendations carry such weight that everyone wants to start working on them right away?
Yeah, two things, I think. That is an excellent question. And by the way, it's not all rainbows and puppies. I mean, there are some criticisms sometimes along the way from some of the individual commission members who have their own political platforms at times. But I would say two of the things that make the report so relevant and well respected. One is that the members of the commission, this volunteer advisory group, are selected because they have important voices in their respective sector or community. And when they can find common ground with the other 25 voices, that draws attention. You know, it's not just a single issue advocacy group making a recommendation. It shows rich diversity. And the other one is just simply our commission also has two very well-placed legislators. One, the chairman of the Senate Environment Committee, and one, the chairman of a House Environment Subcommittee. And they and their staff stay very engaged. And also the fact that we have 8 state agencies represented on the commission. So the membership of the commission, as well as the quality of the diversity and finding common ground without offering just milquetoast recommendations, makes the report relevant and respected, not by everybody, but by most of the policymakers that are involved. Thank you for asking. Appreciate that.
Other questions?
All right.
I have a small one while we're waiting to see if any of our advisory council members have other ones. On the work groups, you said the work groups were key. Are they made up exclusively of the 26 members of the commission, or do you invite others to participate in those work groups?
Excellent question. We invite others. So the key is, if commissioners are interested in serving, it's not good if commissioners only just sit at the full commission level and don't get involved in one or more of the subcommittees or the work groups. But the work groups are much larger. I would say the mitigation work group is probably about 70 people. Now, to make it more manageable, it usually ends up that there are like 45 or 50 who attend the meetings. And with virtual meetings over the last year, we probably get at least 70 or more for the mitigation work group. And the adaptation and resiliency work group also has a lot of added people. I can appoint those. I can appoint, as the chair of the commission, I can appoint people to the work groups that are not on the commission but are interested and have value to add or perspectives. And so, I do that and always focus on increasing diversity in all respects to the working groups and making sure that there's a functioning work group. So it's usually a commission member who chairs or co-chairs each of the work groups.
Great. And I assume that contributes to that credibility and respect that you were talking about earlier, that diversity of the participants in those work groups?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And on the, I heard the discussion coming up about some recommendations in Minnesota with respect to the built environment, specifically buildings, reducing or increasing the energy efficiency and electrification of buildings. That has been one of the most robust, we almost shouting matches, and some of the, we have an ad hoc group. It's like a sub work group within the mitigation work group that is focused solely on the buildings challenge, which is important and robust. But again, diversity is the key, not just to resiliency, but also to getting some attention and being viewed as relevant when the recommendations come out.
We have time for maybe one more question for the secretary. Any other questions?
All right.
If we have one more moment, I will jump in and perhaps pose a question just about what's been the reception of the business community and how have you been successful bringing those voices into the climate discussion?
Yeah, great question. So the business community, the energy sector is very engaged in the commission. One of the co-chairs is from the energy generation industry. In terms of the Chamber of Commerce, they're very engaged and interested in following the commission and are very involved in each of the work groups. So the Department of the Environment, and as chair of the commission, I make sure that we brief the chamber and other businesses on a regular basis as to what topics are coming up, possible recommendations. And that's also been the case with the Transportation and Climate Initiative. You know, there's sometimes there's skepticism or cynicism or support, because if the Climate Change Commission can come up with some reasonable recommendations that take into account the business community and follow the magic recipe, as I mentioned, that's in state law that says you have to track net positive impacts to jobs in the economy. That gets the business community and the chamber more engaged and want to be engaged to help influence the discussions about what's achievable and what impact might it have on the business, which is obviously now in the midst of the economic disruption and crisis prompted by the pandemic. They want to make sure that there's also a focus on economic recovery so that greenhouse gas reduction and economic recovery go together and are not viewed as two separate items. I've talked a lot. I appreciate you all's, not everybody exiting the meeting while I was talking. I really do encourage you all to get to know your fellow colleagues on the committee and stay engaged and hash out differences and learn from one another. We're trying to do it, and some days we're extremely successful, and other days there's gnashing of teeth, but it's a good framework to find some common ground that can only benefit the executive branch and the legislative branch and inform the citizens and the communities, our county executives who really have tremendous important role in governing Maryland. Keep an eye on what the commission is doing on these topics that get a lot of attention nationally and also in our state. So thanks so much. I really appreciate the opportunity. I'll follow up with the economic analysis as it relates to the greenhouse gas reductions plan.
Well, we started out, Secretary, asking for sources of inspiration, and you definitely have been one to us. Maryland's work is so relevant to the work that
you need to raise your standards then.
No, your work is so relevant to the work that we're doing here. So I know that the council members, we're going to go and talk about our work groups here later today, and we'll take what we learned from you and follow up with more questions. So incredibly relevant and inspiring, and really appreciate your time today.
Thanks again. Take care.
Thank you. And for the rest of the advisory council members, we're going to take a break before we have our next presenter. And after our break, we'll start to talk about how do we take all of this great information and put it into play here in Minnesota. So we will be back at well, let's see, we're a couple minutes, a little after 2:25. Try to give you a couple more minutes, 2:26, 2:27. All right, thanks everybody.
international climate politics and affairs. So the Memorandum of Understanding creates the baseline commitment that all of our governments agree to. It's a commitment of limiting emissions 80 to 95% below 1990 levels, or to below 2 annual metric tons per capita by 2050. We include those two goals to account for historical emissions disparities in some of the developing regions. And we support those governments through our project work. Here is a visual map of where our governments are. We have significant footprints in the Western Hemisphere, Europe, and kind of South Asia and the Pacific. We're still building our membership in Africa and Eastern Europe. In the US, we have 13 member states and I think over a dozen cities that are members. We support our government members in a variety of ways. Mostly I'm going to be talking today about some of our knowledge sharing platforms to connect our governments with their peers across the globe and let them share what their experience has been as well, so that everyone can learn from and benefit from the variety of experiences that governments are having at the moment, and hopefully accelerate and amplify the solutions that are working the best and ways to get around common barriers. But we also provide support in communications, access to international events and processes, and support in connecting them directly for bilateral work with other governments. So a brief overview of our work streams. As I mentioned, we do work in charting pathways to net zero by 2050. I'll be going to more details of this process later on. But essentially, we've developed a government stakeholder facilitation and modeling process through which our governments are able to chart their path to their long-term goals. We also have a variety of policy action projects, and I'll highlight a couple of those later on as well. These focus on sharing best practices and learnings from experiences of our governments across the world. We also bring in third-party experts on particular issues, specifically technical issues such as improving the data quality of inventories, or on zero emission vehicle policies, or methane technologies. So those are more capacity building. And then finally, in transparency, we run an annual process through which our members disclose not just their emissions inventories, but also what actions they've taken in the last year, so that they can chart their progress towards their targets, and also look at any patterns that come up across regions and opportunities for collaboration. So I'm going to go through a couple of case studies from 2 members. I'm going to look at Quebec first, and then your fellow American state, Oregon. Then I am going to go into some detail on our pathways work, and a little bit on a couple of our policy action projects. And again, if there are any questions as I go, please feel free to ask. I can't guarantee I will know necessarily the answer to everything, because we do have a large team. And so particularly for the Pathways Project and the policy action projects, we have dedicated staff that are running these projects and know the ins and outs of them. So I might have to go consult people, but I'm always happy to come back to you all as a group with any more details as requested. So Quebec, like Minnesota, is a very active member of our coalition. They are on our steering group along with Minnesota, helping us in running and governing the coalition. In the fall of 2020, they published a new plan for what they call a green economy. it set out a course towards carbon neutrality by 2050 with an interim target of 37.5% below their 1990 level emissions. And what they really focused on, and what I was leveraging their hydroelectricity resources and using that as a way, basically a jumping off point for decarbonizing their entire economy. And they have, a different governing system there. They have a parliamentary system. So some of the political structures are very different. But what I wanted to highlight about Quebec's process is the public consultation process that they undertook. So they developed a strategy that focuses on leveraging their hydroelectricity capacity. They already produce about 99% of their electricity with zero carbon hydroelectric power, and they have even more capacity for that. So they're really focusing on electrifying everything that can feasibly be electrified, because that is the fastest and cheapest way for them to reach their emissions targets. They're also hoping to export that advantageous natural resource. So exporting hydroelectricity to other areas of Canada, possibly even to northeastern US states, and innovating in new other green types of energy like green hydrogen or renewable biomass-based gas, so that they can even decarbonize heavy industry and other sectors that where it's not practical to electrify. And then they're also focusing as well on adapting to climate change, creating green infrastructure in their urban environments, and including all of their diverse communities in this process. And that's where I get to this public consultation process that they ran. So first they created civil society working groups by sector. So a transportation group, an electricity group, a heavy industry group that included stakeholders from a variety of segments of sectors. So within the transportation working group, it was, corporates, car companies, transportation, municipal authorities, a variety of different stakeholders. And each of those working groups provided direct input on the formation of this clean energy and green economy plan. They also had several of their ministers tour the entire province to all of the different municipalities, having public forums and speaking directly with citizens and regional community-based groups about the impact of this plan and what it might mean for them. They also worked with all levels of local government to ensure that their priorities and needs for implementing this plan would be included and accounted for. And then they did open public consultations through an online comment period. They received over 3,000 public comments. And they also created briefings on each kind of element of the plan that were written specifically for public audiences. So they really had a very comprehensive approach. And I think what is really important for this is that they included the public consultation process as a key planning element from the beginning, rather than just tacking it on to the end once they had already created the plan. And so we were very excited for them to create such a detailed plan, because we have a lot of members that have created a net zero target, but haven't yet charted such a detailed path to getting there. Another example I wanted to call out is Oregon. They have a difficult political situation there. The legislature 2 years in a row failed to pass climate legislation. And so Governor Brown did an executive order directing her agencies to take executive action where possible. And it ended up being more of a sectoral approach rather than an economy-wide approach. because they had to stay within the bounds of existing law and the authorities already given to their state agencies. But they've had a lot of success. They've already redirected 60% of their federal funding to zero emission and low emission transportation modes. They've already created an adaptation framework and a health report. So they're really moving quite quickly. And I think the reason I wanted to highlight this is just to give some examples of the power that state governments have, even if there are kind of roadblocks and intransigence in certain branches of the government. Now I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the Climate Pathway Project. And Mariah, if I'm running over on time, please do just give me a wave. I mentioned this in the beginning. This is our main project where we're helping our governments chart a path towards their net zero by 2050 targets. It's funded by the government of Norway. And we include 7 states across Latin America because the project funders wanted us to focus on heavily forested districts. So essentially, we provided technical assistance to their government officials in showing them how to create these pathways, and then also sharing those best practices with the rest of our coalition. So this is just an overview of what the pathways process looks like that we've developed. So it's in 3 phases. First, you have to, take stock of where you're at, see what your business as usual emissions growth would look like, and then set your targets and your vision. You design some scenarios based on different policy actions you could take, look at what the modeling looks like on impact on your economy and your emissions, and select a pathway. And then you design your kind of monitoring and verification process so that you can ensure that you stay on track to meeting all of your interim targets. And the stakeholder engagement really happens throughout this entire process. And the stakeholder engagement strategy that we've developed is really what I'm going to focus on here, because I think that is where we see the actual work take place in getting key constituencies on board with the vision for net zero and what it'll take to get there. So for our stakeholder engagement in this project, there are 4 kind of key elements. First, you have to establish a core team. So a core team might be something like this advisory board that is involved in the engagement with each of the category holders so that there's continuity and that there's some group of officials that is hearing from each of the groups of stakeholders and there's not kind of silos. Then you want to identify and classify your stakeholders, design an engagement strategy, and then continuously communicate the outcomes of your vision setting and your modeling process to them. I'm not going to go through all of these because these are some detailed models that we've developed, but essentially, a lot of stakeholder engagement starts with just a list of stakeholders, but we have to realize that not every stakeholder is going to have the same amount of influence or interest in the process. And so you don't want to overburden some stakeholders with too much information, but then engage other stakeholders not sufficiently at certain moments. So you want to know who you need to engage when and how much. So this is an example from one of our members in Brazil, Mato Grosso, where this is just where some key stakeholders might land in this graph and the different quadrants. So for example, the national government energy department has a lot of influence over whether or not this region will meet its targets, but they might not be as interested in the state does itself because it's the national government. And conversely, the community-based organizations are not going to have as much influence on the emissions pathway of the region, but they are very, very interested and will have a lot of impacts on them based on how those policies develop. So this is just an overview of once you have all of those stakeholders mapped, you want to engage the high-level representatives of the group so that representatives that are trusted within that community. You want to involve them early in the process so that they have some ownership and feel, you know, really involved and like this is, you know, they have a stake in it. And we can agree rather than overburdening some with too much information or vice versa. So another, just again, just kind of an example from a region in Peru and a region in Mexico. For them, the easiest way to get the right level of engagement was to group their stakeholders by sector. So not only to allow them to provide detailed information in the sectors that those stakeholders were interested in without burdening them of too many details of things they weren't interested in, it made the stakeholders themselves more comfortable in providing input because it was something that they felt confident in their knowledge of and were experts in and were able to really dive into details and provide you know, contributions that were valuable. So those are some examples from our Pathways project. I'm just going to give a couple examples also of some of the stakeholder engagement and cross-government collaboration that we have in a couple other policy action projects, which are more sectorally based. So our industry transition platform is a project that Minnesota actually participates in. And this is a policy innovation project where we have, I believe it's 10 governments from both Europe and North America collaborating on designing policies and identifying barriers on specific challenges facing the industry sector, heavy industry in particular, in terms of long-term decarbonization. And I'm highlighting this because this is a prime example of using your peer governments as information sources and as collaborators. So these governments are all working together to identify strategies to address some of the common barriers they all face as highly industrialized regions. And I believe Aditya is on the line. So if we have questions, if anyone has questions about Minnesota's participation in this project, he would be the best person to discuss it. And then the ZEV community is another example of this peer learning model. This is a project that we've been doing in partnership with C40 and US Climate Alliance and ZEV Alliance to basically consolidate all of the various peer learning and policy innovation forums that have been going on with regards to zero emission vehicles. In particular, this is focusing on making sure there's alignment between different levels of government. So that's why it's really important that we had C40 on board so that city governments, state governments, and county governments could all be receiving the same information and kind of in the same conversations so that they can start collaborating on creating streamlined processes for rolling that out across levels of government. So that is all I have for you today. I'm happy to go back and give more information on any of this, and apologies if I sped through it a little bit, but those are some good examples, but we have other projects going on as well. So if you're curious about other sectors or even other regions and what's going on there, I'm happy to share more.
Great. Who has questions for Sarah? Is that Hilda? Do you have a question for us? Hilda, do you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I
think she's
so.
on mute.
Yeah, I am. Yeah, now I'm mute. I'm on mute.
Great.
Thank you, Sarah, for your presentation. I wanted to ask you about the deep decarbonization part. Most of the examples that you provide were for developing countries. Are you only working with developing countries, or are you working also with developed countries, with like states or regions in developed countries? That is one.
Yeah.
That is one, and the other one is, sometimes when we talk about these long-term pathways to 2050, it's sometimes I've seen two things. One is that people think you're not doing anything in the short term because you're thinking in a long term, but I guess you need both of them. So how does the regions you've been working with have seen this way of thinking of some of the stakeholders?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I'll definitely get to that. On your first question, so at the moment, our current project focuses only on those governments, but the pathways process that we've developed is applicable to any government. So the process was not designed to be suited for developing regions. That being said, we have a new project that we've just launched called Net Zero Futures, which is still taking shape, but essentially governments that have net zero targets already are going to share their experiences of institutionalizing and defining what net zero means for their government, and what they think that's going to look like, as like kind of a introduction and a learning process for those that are interested in setting a net zero target. And what we're hoping to do, and the reason I'm bringing this up, is that what we can build onto after the project, with just starting with a generic economy-wide net zero target, is then the next step would be looking at individual sectors and working with the governments that already have net zero targets, which are mostly from more wealthy regions, so mostly in Europe and North America, although we do have a few in Asia and Latin America, to start charting out what that net zero target looks like in different sectors. I know California is very interested in working with us on this, and we would love to include Minnesota in developing a potential project as well, to make sure that it's as valuable as possible for you all. Second point, that is something that is coming up increasingly more in our pathways work. As I mentioned, up until this point, we've really been working with developing regions for whom just the idea of reaching net zero is quite novel and requires them to really think about what their economy might look like in a net zero world. But I think as we start working directly with governments that already have that target instituted, there is going to be a large push to start looking at near-term and interim targets and how to create accountability for those. So as you saw with Quebec, they have a carbon neutrality by 2050 target, but they started with a very specific numerical target for 2030. And so what we're probably going to start talking more and more to governments about is, now that you have a net zero target, or now that you have a long-term target, 80 to 90% below, what is your 2025 target? What is your 2030 target? And what is your accountability? I think we're probably going.
I lost Sarah. Can other people hear her?
No, I think we lost her.
Okay. Sarah, I don't know if you can hear me. Oh, there we go. Now we can hear you.
Okay. Sorry about that. So whether you 2030 or 2031 or 2028, the real issue is just keeping yourself accountable, keeping your government accountable, and having some sort of interim target and a verification process. Having an interim target doesn't do much if you're not tracking your emissions every year and publishing them and allowing the public to hold you accountable whether you're meeting that interim target. And so that's where our transparency work comes as well. And that's why our transparency and our pathways team work really closely together, because the only way the pathway is going to be useful is if it's tied to accountability and being able to track your progress.
Thank you.
Other questions for Sarah? Anyone else have a, go ahead, Frank.
Yeah, I'll jump in and just, Sarah, if you could provide us with some of the lessons learned or best practices, especially for this engagement, or for example, with Quebec and their public consultation about how they were able to be as active as possible and getting as many voices and perspectives as possible involved with their discussions.
Yeah. One of the things that is really useful in these processes, and you'll notice, I'll go back to this slide, instead of just doing working groups or just doing an online public consultation, doing all of them all at once on top of each other and providing multiple and varied ways for the public to engage you, instead of just having an online platform or just having an in-person forum once every quarter. It allows for a variety of different types of people, because one thing is, as much as we're all now used to doing everything online, particularly after COVID, we still have large segments of the population that don't have regular access to Wi-Fi or online platforms. We also have, members of communities that are just not going to have the time to go to an in-person forum. So having multiple platforms available was really important to them. In addition, I think having that high-level senior political official doing some of that engagement showed a level of commitment and buy-in from the higher levels of government. So having multiple ministers travel around the province in person and speak directly to constituents was a really strong signal that this was a political priority, but also the stakeholder engagement was a political priority as well. And so I think those two things really made it a success. I'll also say from our Pathways program, we also have seen states choose different media for their engagement. So some preferred in-person workshops, all-day workshops where they brought a bunch of stakeholders in person and had presentations. Others preferred to just do it solely over WhatsApp, and they would just create WhatsApp groups of the key representatives from different stakeholder groups. And that was the easiest way to communicate with everyone. So knowing what media and form of communication is going to reach the types of groups that you want to ensure get that information is as important as the content as well.
Great. Any other questions for Sarah?
And I'm happy to share this presentation if there are follow-up questions later.
That's great. Thank you, Sarah. I'm sure if you can, if Frank doesn't already have that, that'd be great. We will definitely send that around. But we do have two more questions. The first is from Chris Clark.
Thanks, Sarah. Just curious in the Pathways work if you've had success in prioritizing where to go next. It strikes me that chasing the last 10% or 20% in any sector is probably the toughest work. And when you're working across the many different industrial sectors, at some point there's probably more that can be achieved quickly by focusing more resources. Transportation right now seems like one that has a lot of opportunity, and just curious if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah. Do you mean, sorry, just to clarify, do you mean where to go next in terms of implementation, or once you get to the last 10 to 20% of emissions, sectorally, where to focus?
The first is really what I was getting after.
Yeah. Well, and this might be shaped a little bit by the fact that we are thus far have been working with developing regions, but it's becoming increasingly clear that the next phase of planning really has to be with resources and financing. And they, look at the plans that they have after these really intense processes. And the immediate question is like, these are all great policies. We do not have the revenue to implement these right now. We don't know how to finance it. And related to developing regions. There are budget issues across governments. So I think what we're looking at is how to start incorporating financial mechanisms to start creating funds for some of these policies and investments to enable them to kind of see a practical on the ground route to actually implementing some of the policies that we put forward.
Micah, your hand was up and then it went down. Do you have a question still?
No, that answered part of one. And I was just wanted to go back to Sarah. First of all, thanks a lot for coming and talking to our group. Just building off of what Frank's question was earlier, when we get into the work groups and looking at that success, one of the things, and this is really kind of getting into the weeds, one of the things always trying to be mindful of is how we can keep the work groups nimble and moving, but at the same time trying to get that right stakeholder engagement. And what has been your experience in working with these groups? Is there any kind of formula that tends to work well, or is it really just kind of figure it out as you go?
It really depends. I mean, so first I will say that I'm not the project manager for any of these projects. I'm the government relations lead. So I'm kind of taking all of the findings from all of these projects and consolidating and filtering them out back through the coalition. So I am more than happy to connect you all with some of my colleagues that have run some of these stakeholder working groups. And additionally, I'm happy to connect you directly with Quebec and see if they can give you some direct examples from their public consultation process. But what I've found just in terms of talking with my colleagues that have run these is that it really depends on the jurisdiction and the sector. So, for example, doing stakeholder engagement in a rural region of Peru with a lot of communities that speak indigenous languages, having translation to different languages was super important for them, not necessarily going to be an issue for Minnesota, right? Simultaneously, having corporate engagement on the working groups for the industry transition platform was important to get that buy-in. That might not be the case in all sectors. So I think it just is clear to me that it's very individualized by the jurisdiction, unfortunately, which is not the answer anyone wants to hear, because it means that you can't just take a model and copy and paste it. You can take kind of the structure and see where you can tweak it to suit your needs, but I would doubt that there would be anything that would be like just, perfectly formatted for another jurisdiction. But again, like just the example of the WhatsApp group, I think is the most relevant for you. That is super specific to their professional culture. Like they use WhatsApp as a form of formal professional communication. And for those who don't know, WhatsApp is a texting app. So it's literally just a text group. And that obviously allows more instantaneous communication, but it also allows them to add people who have, there's so many other issues when you're working in developing countries, but a lot of them have like memory capacity issues with their professional emails. And so you can't really conduct a lot of business over your professional email server because there's not enough memory for them to like save all of those emails. So they do it over WhatsApp because then they can send files and have webinars and things. So again, making sure that you're using the right media is important so that you can include everyone you need to include, and also that they're going to see it. If you're working with a group that they don't check their email very often, then maybe you find another way to stay in communication. I don't know if that's answering your question, but that's kind of the different adjustments that I have seen my colleagues make in managing these projects to ensure wider participation.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So much of what you shared is germane to what we're about to do. So we're going to break into our work groups here in a minute, and one of their first tasks is going to be to do some stakeholder mapping, so that the graphic that you shared of interest and influence, it might not be an entire model, but I think that's a specific concrete thing that we. Oh, you probably.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can, I think.
Okay, I can. Actually, the little button to share attachments in the chat isn't where I was going to just attach the PowerPoint into the chat, but I don't know if I have that capability. So I'll just send it to Frank right now. And if you guys, and he can share it with you all for reference for the rest of the meeting.
Great, I appreciate that. And I'm sure we will follow up as we start to get specific here on how we're going to do our work. So we really appreciate you being here today and all your work and willingness to connect with us again.
Yeah, and let me know if you have any questions in the future for sure.
Great. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you all.
All right, we have 10 or 15 minutes to just talk a little bit about our work groups before we break into them. So after that time, we'll break up into our work groups, and I'll talk about the logistics of that in a minute. And in those work groups, we'll be focusing on how you want to get started, both conceptually with things like stakeholder mapping and logistically when you're going to meet and how you're going to meet and those kinds of things. But before we do that, I'm wondering if there are questions or thoughts that you have about the idea of our work group. So bigger picture things that you want to discuss together as a group before we break into our work groups, and or any thoughts that you have following up on those presentations that we had today. And Kevin, this could be a place where you could jump back in with your question if it's still relevant. So I'm just going to open up the floor for some discussion of work groups and everything that we've done today. Feel free to just jump in.
This is Alex. I think it'd be helpful for us to or maybe for you to re-articulate the goals of the work groups, just so we're all on the same page and we don't spend the first, 10 or 15 minutes figuring that out.
Yeah, so we will go over when we're in our breakouts the specifics of what we want you to focus on in this very first short meeting. And we can, you should have in your email from last week the overview of the work groups, which will give you the longer framework so you can reference that when you're in those meetings, if that's helpful. But from that document, I can tell you that what we labeled as the scope was to build relationships and catalyze climate action. So the main idea is that we want you all to be using your networks, your relationships, the places that you are in the state to be helping the state engage with other Minnesotans either differently than the state is able to or good at doing or has connections to think about how do we get lots of folks in this conversation and coming up with some plans and some policies that lots of folks support and are willing to not just support, but to work towards. Because one thing that we know is that we have at times come up with plans and then we haven't been able to implement those plans. So it's a focus on building those relationships and building that shared understanding and shared commitment to action, and then thinking about how do we actually act and collaborate and work together. So it's a lot about engagement. It's a lot about working with different audiences and using that framework document that Frank shared with you last week as a tool and a starting point for some of those conversations. Frank or Katie, do you want to add anything else to that?
I can jump in. Hi, all. Part of the idea here, and I think you all have observed this and are catching on, and part of why we brought the speakers in that we did today is, there's no perfect recipe, right? We have to make this up as we go. We have to figure out how are we going to work together, get more people involved towards these ends. And so the work groups are a chance to really roll up our sleeves and dig into that a little bit in the particular topic areas that we have set up. And so this is your chance to be creative and say, what, this is, these are some things I think we need to do together that are going to help us move the needle. We are building an action plan for the state. And that's another thing that in the work groups, we want you to think about with alongside of us. Are we saying the right things in the action plan? How do we get others to be invested in this plan so it feels like a plan that they can see themselves in? These are all questions we're going to kind of grapple with in the work groups.
Sometimes what we're used to is trying to get a list of recommendations, and it's not quite that. It is that we want to land on some sort of list of ideas that we're going to move forward, but it's thinking about that a little bit differently. It's thinking about developing some sort of a list or set of policies that folks feel bought into, but making sure that we have those relationships, that shared understanding, that shared commitment to go from some sort of a list of priorities to something that we're actually implementing, because that's where we get stuck, I think. So a creative process, as Katie said, without too much of a map, though we will try to learn from other folks who have had some successes like the ones we heard from today and other places. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of regrounding in that charge. Hilda?
Yeah, I have a question, because Katie just mentioned that, and in one of the documents you said that the state is working in the climate action plan, and then I know this framework that Frank also shared with us, and there's like the different strategies and actions that you want to do. So how can we link the work that we want to do in these three working groups to these two instruments that you are working? Because I think what's the time frame of those two the plan and the framework, and how can this be linked to the things we're going to do on the working group? Because we don't want to invite, well, that's my thinking, we don't want to bring other stakeholders besides this group, and then maybe they do participate, and then the time frame of the three things are different. So how can we link, or are you planning to link this with the other two?
So I think Katie called it an action plan and Frank called it a framework. Those are the same thing. We've called it so one document. And the idea of that document is that what we have heard is we have started initial engagement on the state side is that climate is too broad for us to go to stakeholders and say, what should we do together on climate? It's too big. And yet we know if we come with a prescribed list and say, here's the 10 things that we're going to do on climate, then folks will rightfully feel that we didn't ask them and engage with them and hear their priorities. But we have clearly had asked to say, let us know what your starting point is. And so that's what that framework or that action plan, it could go by either name, is to say, here's what we think we've heard stakeholders say so far. Here's what we think the science supports. Here's what the administration feels is possible and is focusing on. Here's a starting point. And then we want to be doing multiple things at that starting point. We want to be changing it and improving it based on what people say and the engagement that the work groups will do, as well as the engagement that the state is doing. So it'll change and we'll have new ideas. But what we really want to be doing is getting, again, this sort of shared commitment around a general direction and ideas about how we're all going to collaborate. So it isn't sort of just a list of policies that the state needs to get implemented, but how everybody's going to contribute to getting those implemented, whether that's talking to their neighbors or being active at the Capitol or, sharing information or what. And so the timeline has multiple horizons, as you asked about earlier, Hilda. So one horizon is that Climate Week is in September. And so we would like to have a fair amount of engagement done ahead of Climate Week so that we can use Climate Week to share some of what that framework is going to be and what the engagement has produced and what we're going to lead up into the next legislative session for. So the next legislative session will always be a timeline, but some of the work we know will have a longer horizon. So we know that those relationships and that communication will be towards implementing some policies that won't happen in the next session for whatever reasons. Does that answer your questions, at least at a high level?
Yes, thank you.
Great. I think we have Alex next.
So something that might be important for all the work groups to talk about is funding and money, because that seems to come up a lot. It came up in response to a question posed to the last speaker. I think it came up when we were talking to the state legislators during our last meeting. And seems like we have some great opportunities for potential funding. We may have a massive federal infrastructure bill that passes in the next few months that would have a lot of climate provisions and a lot of money that might go to states and to various projects. And even if that doesn't pass in Congress, we have, all of the federal agencies, throughout the federal government, probably focusing a lot more on providing funding for various climate-related projects that all are going to be within these various work groups. So, one way, I guess, that we could think strategically instead of just various lists of policies is to try to, tie various things that, we might. Seems like you can get more agreement on how to move forward when there's money available or potentially available to do that. And we should think strategically about that.
Frank, do you want to say anything about that potential of federal money?
Yeah, sure. And certainly we're waiting to hear what the infrastructure bill is, but we are also looking at what is available through the American Rescue Plan, the ARPA, and the funding there. However, that is closely tied to COVID recovery, but we are looking for ways that we can build in climate as a co-benefit with some of those funds. And then we also are waiting for EPA to give us a little bit more information on funding that they've received through the America Recovers Fund, I think is what it's called, or America Rescue Plan. That is directed at particularly at environmental justice, and if we can work with EPA and again get either climate as a direct benefit or a co-benefit of that going forward, but that certainly is something that we are keeping our eye on and awaiting to hear from our federal partners, from all of the sub-cabinet agencies about what may be available coming up here in the next 6 months.
But absolutely, that's true. It's easier where there's funding for things, and absolutely part of what we hope the work groups will do is help us be strategic about where our opportunities, whether those are fiscal or political or what have you. Any other high-level questions about the work groups or thoughts about the presentations before we break into our work groups? All right, well, I'm going to pass it over to Commissioner Stroman, who's going to close the public section of our meeting today. We'll close that out, and then the advisory council will stay on the platform, and then we'll move into talking about the logistics of going into our breakout groups, which is not a thing that streams well. So that's why we're going to close the public section for now. So Commissioner Stroman, I'll pass it to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mariah. This really has been, I think, a really good discussion here today. And as we close out this portion of the meeting and move into the work groups, I really do want to thank again our presenters, both Secretary Grumbles and Ms. Duffy. I also want to extend thanks to all the advisory council members here today. I think that the presenters shared some really great perspectives, and I think as we started to hear in the questions and discussion, there really are some ideas there that can help spur further thought about our approach here in Minnesota. And as we were just talking about, and Mariah said that shared understanding of and that commitment to climate action is really foundational to the work I think that we have ahead of us here in Minnesota. And I know that, making sure that we've listened to diverse perspectives, that we've created a sense of inclusion and involvement will help us get to solutions that are more sustainable and more successful over time. And I know that's a shared goal of this group as we work on climate issues. So I will just say I'm really excited for the council's creation of these work groups, and I'm really excited for the work that you are going to do with Minnesotans across the state in a variety of ways to build those really important relationships to catalyze climate action. And then just lastly, I want to thank the members of the public who took time out of their busy days today and to view the meeting. And just remind those folks you can keep up to date on the Advisory Council and ways to engage with agencies on climate through the Our Minnesota Climate website. And with that, I will conclude the public portion of the meeting. And Mariah, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you. All right, Frank, if you want to end the live stream.